The modern diagnostic screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red, declaring the multi-million-dollar jet officially grounded. A cocky young flight instructor crossed his arms, smirking at the 72-year-old veteran. "It's a brick, old man." 2 minutes later, the tarmac shook, the turbines screamed, and the old man was airborne. The Mojave Desert sun beat down on the shimmering concrete of the private airfield, baking the air until it rippled like water. Sitting at the center of the tarmac, looking like a predatory bird temporarily chained to the earth, was a meticulously restored McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. Its matte camouflage paint job absorbed the brutal midday light, while the newly retrofitted glass cockpit gleamed with a sterile, modern sheen. To David Whitmore, an eccentric tech billionaire with a penchant for collecting Cold War relics, the Phantom was his crown jewel. He had spent upwards of $12 million not only purchasing the decommissioned fighter, but paying an elite aerospace engineering firm to drag its avionics into the 21st century. Today was supposed to be the day it flew to the Reno Air Races, the centerpiece of an exclusive historic exhibition. There was just one glaring problem. The multi-million-dollar crown jewel refused to wake up. Standing in the shadow of the massive swept wing was Bradley Townsend. At 28, Bradley was the chief safety certifier for the high-end aviation brokerage ensuring the flight. He wore a tailored, fire-retardant flight suit that looked as though it had never seen a drop of sweat, let alone engine grease. In his hands, he held a ruggedized tablet connected via a thick black diagnostic cable to the Phantom's underbelly. "I'm telling you, Mr. Whitmore, it's a hard no-go," Bradley said, his voice clipped and dripping with the absolute certainty of a man who trusted code over common sense. He tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up a cascading list of red error logs. "The telemetry is explicit. We have a master caution loop. The starboard engine hydraulic bypass is failing, accompanied by an absolute drop in the primary fuel manifold pressure. The digital management system has locked out the igniters." Whitmore, sweating through his expensive linen shirt, rubbed his temples. "Bradley, I paid your firm a fortune to ensure this plane was race-ready. Are you telling me a sensor went bad?" "It's not a bad sensor," Bradley corrected, his tone adopting a patronizing edge. "It's a catastrophic hardware failure detected by the sensors. If we somehow bypassed the safety lockouts and hit the igniters right now, the combustion chamber would flood with JP-8 fuel. The moment the spark hits, we'd have a localized explosion that would blow the right wing off. The jet is unflyable. It's a dead piece of iron." A few feet away, leaning against the humming yellow auxiliary power cart, stood Arthur Gable. Arthur was 72 years old, though his posture remained as rigid as a steel girder. He wore a faded green leather bomber jacket, despite the 100-degree heat, a pair of scuffed aviator sunglasses, and a quiet, unreadable expression. He didn't look like a man who belonged in the modern era of touch-screen interfaces and automated flight management systems. His face was lined with deep creases, a map drawn by decades of pulling G-forces and breathing pure, dry oxygen through a tightly strapped mask. Arthur wasn't an insurance certifier. He was the pilot. More importantly, he was the original pilot. In 1971, Arthur had flown this exact airframe, tail number 68-0339, through the hostile skies over the Gulf of Tonkin. He knew the Phantom not as a piece of machinery, but as a living, breathing partner that had brought him home when half its tail rudder had been shredded by anti-aircraft fire. "Captain Gable," Whitmore said, turning to the veteran with a pleading look, "is there anything we can do? The exhibition needs this bird in the air in less than 2 hours." Before Arthur could speak, Bradley scoffed, unplugging his diagnostic cable with a sharp yank. "With all due respect to the captain's service, Mr. Whitmore, there is nothing he can do. You can't fly a plane when the central computer says the engine is a bomb. I'm grounding the aircraft. I'm not signing the release, and my firm is pulling the insurance binder as of this minute." Arthur slowly pushed himself off the power cart and walked over to the young certifier. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate. When he stopped in front of Bradley, he didn't look at the tablet. He looked straight at the young man's face. "Son," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the desert wind. "What did you say the manifold pressure is reading?" Bradley sighed, the universal sound of a busy professional forced to humor a child. He held up the tablet, pointing to a brightly colored graph. 0.2 psi. The J79 engine requires a minimum of 40 psi on spool-up. The fuel pump isn't catching because the hydraulic bypass valve is stuck open. The computer is doing its job, Captain. It's saving your life." Arthur turned his gaze from Bradley to the massive intake of the starboard engine. He didn't see digital graphs. He saw miles of mechanical linkages, heavy steel valves, and raw analog engineering. He remembered the smell of the JP-8, the heavy bone-rattling vibration of the twin turbines, and the peculiar quirks of a machine built before microchips ruled the world. "The physics haven't changed, son," Arthur said quietly, stepping past Bradley toward the boarding ladder hooked to the cockpit. "But your computer doesn't know how to read them." "Hey!" Bradley barked, stepping forward to block him. "What are you doing? I just said the aircraft is grounded. FAA regulations state that under a master caution lockout." "I'm not flying under FAA regulations right now," Arthur interrupted, not raising his voice but commanding the space with an ironclad authority that made the younger man instinctively take a half-step back. "I'm operating under the authority of the owner to diagnose a mechanical fault. Isn't that right, David?" Whitmore swallowed hard, looking between the angry young certifier and the calm, immovable veteran. Yes, just be careful, Arthur. If Bradley is right, we don't want a fire." "He's not right," Arthur said, placing a calloused hand on the aluminum rail of the ladder. He looked down at Bradley one last time. "Your tablet is a smart piece of glass, kid, but it's talking to a ghost." The air inside the cockpit of the Phantom was sweltering, trapped beneath the heavy canopy. As Arthur settled into the worn ejection seat, a wave of profound familiarity washed over him. The smell was exactly the same as it had been 50 years ago, a distinct, intoxicating blend of old canvas, hydraulic fluid, ozone, and dried sweat. The instrument panel, however, was an abomination to his eyes. The beautiful, chaotic array of analog dials and mechanical gauges had been ripped out and replaced with sleek, dark, digital multifunction displays. The engineers who had performed the retrofit had essentially grafted a modern supercomputer onto the nervous system of a prehistoric beast. Bradley stood at the bottom of the ladder, his face red with anger and heat. "Captain Gable, I am officially logging this as a breach of protocol. If you hit the master power, I am calling security." Arthur ignored him, reaching up and securing his helmet. He strapped himself into the 5-point harness with a muscle memory that had never faded. He flipped the master battery switch. The glass screens flickered to life, bathing the dark cockpit in a sterile, modern glow. Instantly, an automated female voice began to sound in his headset, cold and synthetic. "Warning, Engine 2, hydraulic bypass failure. Manifold pressure, critical. Start sequence locked." Arthur smiled faintly. It was a cold, lifeless voice, nothing like the screaming, vibrating feedback the jet used to give him when it was hurting. He knew exactly what the problem was, because he knew the men who had designed the Phantom, and he knew how they had plumbed the beast. The modern engineers who had installed the digital sensors had placed the primary fuel pressure monitor on the secondary bleed air line, assuming the pressure differential would remain constant. It was standard practice for modern, highly efficient turbofans, but the J79-GE-17 engine wasn't modern, and it sure as hell wasn't efficient. It was a brute force ramjet designed to push a house-sized block of metal through the sound barrier. When the auxiliary power unit spooled up, it created a massive, momentary vacuum in the bleed air line. A false negative. The modern sensor was reading that vacuum, panicking, and telling the computer that the fuel lines were completely empty. The computer, in its infinite digital wisdom, concluded that if the lines were empty, the hydraulic bypass must be stuck wide open, dumping the fuel. It was an illusion, a digital hallucination. The fuel was there, waiting behind a heavy steel valve, ready to burn. All it needed was a spark, but the computer was blocking the signal to the igniters. Arthur reached under the sleek new glare shield, his fingers searching blindly along the original metal bulkhead that the engineers had deemed too deeply embedded to remove. His fingertips brushed against a cold, knurled knob, the manual crossfeed override. It was an analog mechanical linkage that completely bypassed the electrical system, designed for combat scenarios when a pilot's electronics were fried by EMP or battle damage. He pulled the knob hard, locking it into the detent. "Ground control, this is Gable," Arthur spoke into his mic, his voice calm, addressing Whitmore's private crew chief, who was standing 50 yards away. "Clear the blast zone. We're lighting the fires." At the bottom of the ladder, Bradley heard the radio transmission from his handheld receiver. He practically scrambled up the first 3 rungs of the ladder, slapping the side of the fuselage. "Are you insane? You can't override a hard lockout. The computer disabled the starter for a reason. You are going to blow yourself up." "Step away from the aircraft, Mr. Townsend," Arthur commanded, looking down at the young man with eyes as cold as absolute zero. "I'm starting the port engine. You have 5 seconds before the intake tries to breathe you in." Bradley looked into Arthur's eyes and saw no hesitation, no bluff. He cursed violently, jumping down from the ladder and sprinting away across the hot tarmac, dragging his tablet with him. Arthur turned his attention back to the cockpit. He didn't look at the digital screens flashing their angry red warnings. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the vibration of the aircraft through the seat of his pants. Fly the plane, not the panel. He reached forward and manually engaged the pneumatic starter for the left engine. A deep, bone-rattling whine began to build beneath him, a low-frequency rumble that shook the dust off the canopy. The needle on the old analog tachometer, one of the few original instruments left, began to twitch. As the RPMs passed 12%, Arthur drove the throttle forward, physically injecting the fuel into the combustion chamber, completely bypassing the digital governor. Whoosh, boom. The J79 engine, caught with the ferocity of a chained dragon, taking its first breath in decades. A massive tongue of orange flame shot out the exhaust nozzle, sending a shockwave across the tarmac that ruffled Whitmore's clothes and sent Bradley stumbling to his knees. The deafening, high-pitched scream of the turbine shattered the quiet desert morning. The digital screens in the cockpit immediately went chaotic. The computer, realizing the engine was running despite its lockout, threw a dozen new error codes, desperately trying to shut the system down. But Arthur had already engaged the mechanical override. The computer was essentially screaming into a void, completely severed from the mechanical heart of the jet. Without waiting for the screens to stabilize, Arthur immediately initiated the sequence for the starboard engine, the supposedly dead engine. He hit the starter. The whine built up. 10%, 12%. He pushed the throttle out of the cut-off detent. He raised his right hand and tapped his knuckles hard against the glass over the analog fuel pressure gauge, an old pilot's trick to unstick a stubborn mechanical needle. Boom! The right engine roared to life in perfect synchronization with the left. The twin J-79s howled, a glorious, deafening symphony of thrust and power. The air behind the Phantom turned into a violent, shimmering heat mirage, blowing tumbleweeds and loose gravel hundreds of yards across the desert floor. Arthur looked down at his primary digital display. The bright red warnings were blinking furiously, but the raw engine telemetry, the temperatures, the exhaust pressures, the RPMs, were absolutely perfect. The needles sat perfectly in the green. Less than 2 minutes had passed since Bradley had declared the jet a dead piece of iron. Arthur pulled the canopy lever, and the heavy glass dome hissed shut, locking with a solid, satisfying clunk that sealed him in the pressurized, air-conditioned silence of the cockpit. He keyed his radio. Mojave Tower, Phantom N774XT. Engine start is good. Requesting immediate taxi and clearance for an unrestricted climb. In the tower, the air traffic controllers, who had been watching the drama unfold on the tarmac, exchanged stunned looks. They quickly checked their screens. Phantom 4XT, Mojave Tower. You are cleared to taxi runway 30. Departure clearance is granted. Give 'em hell, Captain. Arthur released the heavy pneumatic brakes. The massive fighter lurched forward, feeling light and eager beneath his hands. Outside, Bradley Townsend knelt on the hot concrete, his tailored flight suit covered in dust, clutching his tablet. The screen in his hands was still flashing red, stubbornly insisting that the engines were offline and the plane could not move. He looked up just in time to see the matte-painted Phantom turn onto the active runway. Arthur didn't pause for a standard run-up. He slammed both throttles fully forward into the afterburner detent. Twin pillars of blue-white fire erupted from the exhaust nozzles. The ground literally shook beneath Bradley's feet. With a thunderous roar that tore the sky in half, the F-4 Phantom surged forward, devouring the runway. In seconds, the nose lifted, and the heavy fighter clawed its way into the Mojave sky, banking sharply into a steep vertical climb, leaving a trail of black smoke and a stunned young certifier clutching a useless piece of glass. The Mojave Desert fell away beneath the heavy steel belly of the F-4 Phantom, transforming from a harsh, baking frying pan into a sprawling tapestry of cracked brown earth and distant, jagged peaks. Pinned to the ejection seat by 3 raw G-forces, Arthur Gable felt his chest compress. But a wide, irrepressible grin broke across his weathered face beneath the oxygen mask. The Phantom was flying exactly the way he remembered. It was not a graceful aircraft. It possessed the aerodynamic glide ratio of a falling anvil, famously described by veteran pilots as a triumph of brute thrust over aerodynamic design. Yet, in Arthur's hands, the heavy fighter was a familiar dance partner. He banked right, heading north toward the Sierra Nevada mountains and the waiting crowds at the Reno air races. The twin J-79 engines roared behind him in perfect, synchronized harmony, burning raw JP-8 fuel with a ferocious, unyielding appetite. Down in the sterile, air-conditioned telemetry room back at the Mojave airfield, David Whitmore and Bradley Townsend stood frozen before a massive plasma monitor. The screen was displaying real-time data beamed down from the Phantom's million-dollar digital retrofit. "I don't understand," Bradley stammered, gripping the edge of the console. His knuckles were bone white. He was staring at a cascading wall of red text on the display. "The telemetry says the starboard engine has flamed out. The central computer is registering 0 fuel pressure, 0 hydraulic bypass integrity, and a total electrical desynchronization. By all computational logic, that aircraft is currently an uncontrollable glider plummeting into the desert floor." David Whitmore crossed his arms, watching the glowing green radar blip that contradicted every piece of red data on the screen. The blip was currently passing 15,000 feet and accelerating through 400 knots. "Well, Bradley, unless my $12 million fighter jet has suddenly learned how to levitate, I'd say your software is suffering from a rather severe delusion." "It's not a delusion," Bradley snapped, his professional composure cracking. "The computer is designed to react to sensor data to save the airframe. If the pilot overrides the system, the computer will attempt to compensate for the perceived failure. Mr. Whitmore, the digital fly-by-wire assist, it's still active." David turned, his face suddenly pale. "What does that mean?" "Oh, it means," Bradley breathed, his eyes widening in absolute horror, "the flight management system believes the right engine is dead and the hydraulic pressure is asymmetrical. In about 30 seconds, the computer is going to auto-trim the flight control surfaces to compensate for a single engine failure that isn't actually happening." 200 miles away, tearing through the thin, icy air at 20,000 feet, Arthur felt it before the warning lights even flashed. It started as a subtle vibration in the control stick, a strange artificial stiffness that felt like flying through thick mud. Suddenly, the master caution alarm screamed in his headset. Not the synthetic woman's voice, but a blaring rhythmic electronic horn. Without warning, the Phantom violently pitched down and rolled hard to the right. Arthur's helmet slammed against the canopy glass as negative G-forces lifted him hard against his 5-point harness. The horizon outside spun wildly. The multi-million-dollar digital computer, completely convinced that the right side of the aircraft was dead, had commanded the hydraulic servos to drastically deflect the rudder and ailerons, violently throwing the heavy jet into an uncommanded dive to prevent an aerodynamic stall. It hallucinated was imminent. "Whoa, easy girl," Arthur grunted, his forearms bulging as he seized the control stick with both hands, pulling back and left with every ounce of his strength. It was like trying to wrestle a raging bull. The digital flight system was fighting him, using the massive hydraulic actuators to force the nose down. The sky outside turned into a terrifying blur of brown earth rushing up to meet him. The altimeter spun backward, 19,000, 17,000, 14,000. "Warning, flight control surface conflict. Relinquish manual input," the cold synthetic voice demanded in his ears. "Shut up!" Arthur roared. He knew he couldn't overpower the hydraulic servos forever. The computer was faster, stronger, and completely immune to fatigue. He needed to sever the brain from the muscle, and he needed to do it right now. He shifted the stick entirely into his left hand, fighting the extreme pressure that threatened to snap his wrist. His right hand released the throttle and dropped blindly down to the right side auxiliary console. He didn't look at the sleek new digital screens. He looked past them, searching the shadows for the old, physical circuit breaker panels that the aerospace firm had hidden behind a carbon fiber aesthetic plate. 12,000 feet. The desert floor was approaching at over 600 miles per hour. Arthur's thick fingers clawed at the carbon fiber plate. He wedged his thumb under the edge and ripped it backward. The expensive composite snapped with a loud crack, exposing rows of grey, circular pop-out breakers. His eyes darted across the faded white stenciling. FCS/Auto Trim Master. He grabbed the circular knob and yanked it outward until it clicked. Instantly, the violent pressure on the control stick vanished. The artificial resistance snapped away, and the pure, raw hydraulic linkages returned to his sole command. Arthur hauled back on the stick. The heavy Phantom groaned in protest, the airframe shuddering violently as it pulled out of the catastrophic dive. 7 Gs. The crushing weight squeezed the blood from his brain. His vision tunneled into a tight grey circle, but Arthur tightened his core, executing a perfect anti-G straining maneuver he had learned half a century ago. The F-4 leveled out a mere 3,000 feet above the desert floor, the thunder of its engines kicking up a massive shockwave of dust across the scrub brush below. Arthur let out a long, ragged exhale, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his brow. The digital screens were completely black now, having short-circuited when he forcefully killed the flight control system. He was left with only his analog standby instruments, a mechanical altimeter, an airspeed indicator, and an old magnetic compass floating in fluid. "Mojave Tower, this is Gable," Arthur called out, his voice returning to a steady, unshakable calm. "You can tell the kid his computer just tried to kill me. I've pulled the plug. I'm flying manual the rest of the way to Reno." In the Mojave telemetry room, Bradley stared at the blank screen, his jaw practically on the floor. The old veteran hadn't just survived the computer's fatal error. He had physically disconnected the modern world and taken the jet back to 1971. The Reno-Stead airport was swarming with tens of thousands of aviation enthusiasts. The grandstands were packed, the air smelled of roasted peanuts and exhaust, and all eyes were glued to the southern horizon. Over the public address system, the announcer's voice boomed, trying to mask a hint of rising panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are still waiting on the arrival of David Whitmore's restored F-4 Phantom. We have received word of minor technical difficulties, but we expect the aircraft to make its pass shortly." Inside the cockpit, approaching the Sierra Nevada mountains, Arthur was dealing with anything but minor difficulties. With the main computer dead, his modern navigational screens were blank, reflecting only the harsh glare of the sun. He was navigating by dead reckoning, using a paper map strapped to his thigh, his magnetic compass, and a mechanical stopwatch. It was an art form that the modern aviation world had largely abandoned, but to Arthur, it was as natural as breathing. 2 minutes out, Arthur muttered to himself, checking his fuel gauge. Like the rest of the digital array, the main fuel readout was completely dark. He was flying entirely on intuition, mathematically calculating his burn rate based on throttle position and time aloft. He knew the thirsty J-79s were practically running on fumes. He pushed the nose down, screaming over the mountain ridge, and the sprawling layout of the Reno air races came into view. The long runways, the colorful pylons, and the massive crowd looked like a miniature diorama. Arthur clicked his radio. "Reno Tower, Phantom N774XT, 5 miles south, requesting straight-in approach for runway 26. Phantom 4XT, Reno Tower. You are cleared to land. The crowd is ready for you, Captain." Arthur pulled the throttles back, letting the airspeed bleed off as he entered the final approach corridor. He reached for the landing gear handle and pushed it down. Nothing happened. There was no familiar heavy clunk beneath his feet. The 3 green indicator lights beside the handle remained completely dark. Arthur cursed softly. The landing gear actuators were electrically signaled through the main avionics bus. When he had killed the crazed flight computer to save the plane from diving into the desert, he had inadvertently severed the electronic command pathway for the landing gear. He was 3 miles from the runway, dropping at 200 feet per second with the belly of the jet completely slick. He couldn't go around. He didn't have the fuel for a second pass. Tower, Phantom 4 XT. I have a negative gear indication. I am utilizing emergency pneumatic blowdown. He reached down beside his left knee to a dusty, heavy T-shaped handle painted with yellow and black stripes. This was the emergency pneumatic release. It didn't rely on electricity, computers, or even the primary hydraulic system. It relied on a highly pressurized canister of nitrogen gas designed to physically hammer the heavy landing gear doors open and force the struts down and locked. Arthur gripped the T-handle, twisted it 90 degrees to break the safety wire, and pulled upward with a violent heave. Bang! The sound was like a cannon going off beneath the floorboards. The Phantom shuddered violently. Arthur felt 3 distinct, massive thuds reverberate through the airframe, followed instantly by the beautiful analog illumination of 3 green lights on the auxiliary panel. The massive steel struts had deployed, locking into place just seconds before the runway threshold rushed up to meet him. "Gear is down and locked," Arthur breathed. He flared the heavy fighter. The rear tires slammed onto the hot concrete of runway 26 with a screech of burning rubber that echoed across the grandstands. Arthur immediately pulled the drag chute release lever. A massive, brightly colored parachute erupted from the tail of the Phantom, blossoming in the air and violently jerking the heavy aircraft backward, bleeding off its immense speed. The crowd erupted. Tens of thousands of people leapt to their feet, cheering wildly as the beautiful roaring relic of the Cold War rolled majestically past the grandstands, its engines winding down to a low, guttural growl. Arthur taxied the Phantom perfectly into its designated VYP parking spot. He cut the fuel to the engines. The twin turbines spun down, the deafening roar finally giving way to the cheering of the crowd and the hissing of the cooling metal. He popped the canopy open, letting the cool mountain breeze flood the sweltering cockpit. 10 minutes later, a private helicopter touched down nearby, and David Whitmore sprinted across the tarmac, completely out of breath, followed closely by a very pale Bradley Townsend. Arthur was standing on the tarmac, wiping down the edge of the cockpit with a rag. He looked up as the 2 men approached. "Arthur!" David gasped, looking at the scarred carbon fiber paneling visible inside the cockpit. "Are you all right? The telemetry? The computer? We thought you were going down." Arthur smiled gently, patting the cold steel flank of the massive fighter. "She got a little confused, David. The new brain didn't know how to talk to the old heart. Had to pull the plug and let her fly the way she was built to." Bradley stepped forward, his tablet hanging uselessly by his side. He looked at the massive fighter, then up at the old man in the faded leather jacket. The cockiness, the arrogant reliance on digital certainty, was completely gone from the young certifier's eyes. "Captain Gable," Bradley said, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know how you did that. The algorithm stated recovery from that dive was impossible." Arthur walked over to the young man and placed a heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder. "Son, algorithms are just math. Math is perfect, but the sky isn't. When the glass goes black and the math fails, you can't rely on a microchip to save your life. You have to fly the iron." Arthur turned back to the Phantom, a machine of sheer mechanical willpower that had survived another day. He patted the fuselage one last time, turned, and walked away into the cheering crowd, leaving the young man to reconsider exactly what it meant to be a pilot. If you loved this incredible true story of veteran pilot Arthur Gable teaching modern technology a hard lesson in raw aerodynamics, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this amazing aviation tale with your friends who appreciate real skills over digital screens. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more thrilling, heart-pounding stories of human triumph, engineering marvels, and unsung heroes. Leave a comment below. Would you trust the tablet or the veteran pilot?